Yes, I'd like to know when you were born. Tell me something about the family.
Well, I started very conveniently on January the 1st, 1933.
All right.
And I was the second child of my mom and dad. My father started life as a chemist, and my mother worked in the lab of the small factory that he worked in, which produced chemicals for the dyestuffs and scents and so on in the East End of London. And my older sister, 2 years older, and that was the family, it was the four of us. And really my early life was pretty much dominated by World War II. The war started, and I had been a rather sickly child from the word go, and they'd actually thought of sending me to Switzerland to a sanitarium, but the war stopped that. And so my parents thought, well, we'll send him to Canada to my mother's sister who lived in Toronto. And I didn't know too much about their thoughts, but then they apparently thought, well, that's not fair, because it's one thing if he's a healthy child, but it's not fair to saddle this sister with a child who had a lot of sickness. So I don't think a decision was made, but I simply stayed at home. And we lived in Finchley, which was North London, which of course didn't get anything like the severity of the air raids that South London did, or the dock area. And my sister went to we were really non-religious, but the better school around for girls was a convent, and that school was evacuated to Gloucestershire, and so she left home to do that, and I went to a little day school in Totteridge. It was absolutely goodbye, Mr. Chips, headmaster. It's just a wonderful place, a tiny place, and went through my, in this country, grade school years, my elementary school years there, bicycling to and fro. And we were bombed. We had one bounced off the roof and burn out in the garden, and another one ran right in front of the house and knocked or whatever. So the war was, and I think as a child, you really aren't particularly afraid. It's just what is, because you're little, and as long as your parents aren't afraid, you're not afraid. So that to us, when I say us, I mean all my friends of my age, and I was obviously only 6 when it started, it was sort of an adventure, collecting shrapnel and going to visit where they bombed last night and all of that, plus occasionally having what was obviously a very real tragedy, but as children, again, it doesn't impact you quite the same way at the time, finding that there were empty desks because a child was being killed in an air raid the night before and so on. But it really was an exciting time, and all our games were war games, and we I don't think until much later did I realize that it actually had more of an effect on me psychologically than I knew at the time. And my dad worked in this factory during the Central War work. His factory made blackcurrant puree for pregnant women, for vitamin C, and flamethrowing material for flamethrowers. And he used to often stay at the factory all night because he had to watch for bombs on the factory and pretty much try to protect the factory.
What was the factory called?
It was called Boak Roberts. Small factory that I think eventually was absorbed by, I don't know, the distillers company, or I'm not sure. So that was those years, and I remained a very sickly child, frequently at home, And typical of families at that time, you know, you made your shelter. I helped my father build an air raid shelter. It was full of spiders. I was so terrified of the spiders that I wouldn't sleep there, so we just slept in the house under the dining room table, I was anyway. And before very long, we even stopped that, and I went to bed in my own bed upstairs. I mean, you get used to it. It's just ordinary stuff. So the war ended, my sister came home, and I went away. I went away to, I think, as much as anything, because my father's factory obviously did very well because of the war. He became a director from becoming, he was a chemist, a works manager, and then became director. Incredibly humane man who insisted on paying workers who were injured long before that was a sort of social policy, and if they were killed, paying lifetime pensions to them. And I know other people did that, but he was just a very, very socially minded person. And a friend of Baden Powell's, interestingly enough. He used to go on trips to Switzerland and Germany hiking with him before World War II. So he was a big scout. No, I was a cow, but I hated things like that, so I was like for 1 year I was a cub and then I quit. It wasn't my style. So then, because they could afford it, they thought I should go away to a good English prep school. And the one that was fairly close, and they must have heard something about, was Hartlebury. So I was packed off to Hartlebury, which terrified me, and I was very much in a sense a misfit because of the war. Schools like that accepted kids that they probably wouldn't have accepted at other times, both academically and in terms of background and so on. We wouldn't have had money if it hadn't been for the war. But I went there and for 4 years, and actually loved it. It was, in a sense, the first turning point of my life, because we really grew up in an incredibly ordinary English middle-class life, semi-detached house, no real expectations, maybe a bank clerk, maybe, you know. And Hartlebury opened my eyes to other possibilities, although I was always a kid who didn't belong, and I wasn't particularly good at sports, and I wasn't a very good student. But it still impressed me enormously, and I think I began getting a sense, which certainly my mom and dad never gave me, that maybe there was a God in heaven, you know. It was a very religious state. Hartlebury used to be known as Hartlebury ISC, Imperial Services College, and it was originally the training school for the East India Company. And after the Black Hole in Calcutta, it reopened as a school for sons of clergy and officers in His Majesty's service. But after the war, it pretty much took an awful lot of people from all over, and many of them were people like sons of Indian Army officers who'd been sent because India gained independence. They suddenly, from having servants and a fantastic life in wherever in India, they were selling tennis rackets at Harrods. Big come down. But for all that, it was a very rigid, rugged school with a lot of beating. The older boys beat the younger boys, and it was pretty inhumane in many ways. But it still had this, probably like you get in army regiments, this sort of discipline that led to people having pride in the school that they were at. And I felt that. I felt that there was an enormous amount of kind of camaraderie and loyalty between students and between people within houses and so forth. And so from my point of view, even though I didn't excel at anything, it was a very positive experience.
You were it was a boarding school. You were there the whole time?
No, there the whole time. We weren't really allowed to come home except once during the term. And then, of course, summer holidays, Easter, Christmas, we came home. I think there were 530-odd children there at that time, and they had a mock election. It was probably when Clement Attlee got it, who was an old Haileybuerian. Only about 25 students identified themselves as socialists. There were a few Maharaja's sons and people like that, but it was a very, very conservative school run by a Canon Bonhoeffer, who was a kind of regal figure that you barely ever looked at because he would probably wither you with his gaze. But then I was very much at loose ends and had no idea what to do, and I really struggled because I didn't feel I had any qualifications. And we moved from Finchley to Brookman's Park, which is near Potter's Bar, just north of London. Again, my father's business had done well enough that we could sort of move up to a detached house. And I started out thinking I want to go in the motor industry because I had this very close friend who was a brilliant driver and engineer, a guy called Michael Cox, who worked for Ferrari and was killed testing Ferraris. So I went to Wood School, which was in those days Humber Hillman, some being told at the Comma Carrier, and as an apprentice. And I think I must have lasted about 9 months, and I hated it. I worked on the assembly lines, and I did drafting, and worked in the foundry, and I didn't particularly mind the work. It was that I couldn't, the more I saw it, the more I realized there's nothing here that touches me. It just didn't register. So I quit, much to my dad's sort of upset. And thought, well, the obvious thing to do is go and do my military service, so I went to the Army. And I didn't tell them that I had all these illnesses and so on. So they sent me to officer training, and that led to becoming a young former lieutenant in the artillery. So I did military service and was in a regiment of heavy artillery that was scheduled to go to Korea. And I got sick in my training at Mons in Aldershot. Ended up in the hospital for a while, and then got better and got my commission and went to Wales. And then when we were moving our convoy as a mock exercise to Liverpool, I got sick again so badly that they did all kinds of tests and said, oh, I have a lung disease that meant that I was invalided out. So I was 2 months short of 2 years, but that was the end of military service. And they said, you should really move to Arizona. Well, I thought that was a joke, but again, I was absolutely at loose ends. I worked for my uncle as a bartender in a wonderful old pub in Surrey. He was an artilleryman from World War II, one of my sort of heroes, my uncle. Just because I didn't know what else to do. And then I got a job with ICI. And I literally looked in the Times every day for jobs, and there were 2 jobs, Kemp's Biscuits and ICI. And I tossed a coin and called ICI, had an interview, didn't really know what I was doing. I even said to the interviewer, I'm not even sure I want this job. But they took me, and I was in what was called central purchasing, which was in Buckingham Gate, and my job was to buy coal tar chemicals and petroleum chemicals for explosives and paints, dyestuffs, and so on. And I did that for 3 years. And again, I had this real dilemma. By this time, I'd moved out of my home and got an apartment in London and Chelsea. Really never liked what I was doing. It just didn't add up. And my poor mother was the recipient of most of my angst. But because I hadn't got a degree and I hadn't been to university, and because I didn't really know what I wanted to do, I felt very lost. And I even went to my boss and said, you know, he's I can tell you're not very happy with it. He said, I'll tell you what I'll do. He was a Harvard-trained person, an Englishman that went to Harvard. And he said, look, I'm going to not say anything to anyone, but you can take 5 days in day at a time, whatever, and go for job interviews and see if you can resolve this thing. And at the end of that time, I said, look, I'm sorry, you've been very generous, I'm going to leave. And so I just went home, and to my own home, my family's home. And I remembered having met a year earlier the daughter of the people who founded Springlake Ranch. The daughter had befriended my sister when my sister's first husband died. She went to America to sort of get away, and they shared an apartment on West 71st Street. And then because of that chance encounter, this daughter came to England, and so I spent one evening with her when she stayed with us, telling her how miserable commuting to London and working in the Cameroon Street. And she said, well, if you go crazy, you can come and work for my dad. And I remembered that. And so I sent a telegram to him, actually, and said, you have a job. Anne Sarka will tell you about me. And he sent a telegram back. Anne Sarka, S-A-R-C-K-A. And so I wrote her parent, or actually I wrote her parents, and I think they telegrammed back, Wayne and Elizabeth Sarka, who started the ranch. They just said, do you have a driver's license? And so I cabled back, yes, I do. So then they cabled me back again and said, we'll offer you a job for $25 a week with room and board. And that was it. And I just thought, that's what I'm going to do. But I got kidney stones, I was back in the hospital. I went to the American Embassy to have the physical they required, and they told me I had tuberculosis and I couldn't go. Then they did more tests and said, well, that was a long time ago, you have scarring and so on, but we're going to say it's okay, you can go for 6 months on visitors or whatever it is. And so 6 months after they offered me the job, I said, will you still take me? They said, yes, and I went. And to do that, I had to sell my pension at ICI and cash in all my savings. And I thought I'd go for 6 months, and it would be an experience, and maybe it would help me sort things out. Well, I got there a week before Christmas in 1957. And within a week, I knew I wouldn't leave. It was absolutely, I felt I hit heaven. The place was somewhat of a shambles because the director, Anne's father, was a terrible alcoholic, and it was increasingly getting into debt and failing as an institution. But they'd been going since 1933, so, and his wife was quite up to it. It was just that he was an unhappy man who he was a kind of idea man. He started the ranch and then pretty much left it to his wife to run. Then he got onto the state legislature and put in old age health care, and long before the rest of America had it in the Vermont Assembly. And he'd go on whaling trips in Greenland and Hudson's Bay, and he was just one of those marvelous adventure people. Little guy, thin, emigrated from Finland when he was 9, and because his father had psychosis from working with marble in Finland, he went to work in the marble quarries in Proctor, Vermont, which is near where we live, and grew up supporting his family. And then when he could, he took a job at the YMCA in Springfield and fencing, teaching fencing of all things. And then volunteered for the British Army in World War I and fought in Mesopotamia. Not fought, but was a morale officer in Mesopotamia. And that's where he started drinking. But I love these, the sort of, the one thing about America that is always absolutely fascinating is that people's lives are just all over the place. But he was wonderful and he was a mess. And his wife was equally wonderful and very difficult, very strong-willed and powerful. And she is the sort of woman who had gone as a young woman to Africa on safari. As the only white woman on some adventure out into the outback. I mean, she knew no fear and worked for the United Nations, and worked for, she even worked for the League of Nations, but a Braille student and Braille girls' school in New York. Quite a marvelous person. So I arrived and I was just this young kid, and I did everything. I fixed trucks, I drove trips, I worked on the woods, I lived in a house as a house advisor, and had young people that I had to be responsible for. And when, that was really from 1958, and then my wife came on a ski trip one weekend, 1 year later.
You were married already?
No, this is my fiancée, my wife-to-be. She, the first thing I did after I got to the ranch was to say I want to see America. And after I'd been there for 4 months, they said, all right, you can take off for 4 months if you want. So I just hitchhiked around the United States and Mexico and Canada. And that was unbelievable, because this is one incredible country when you do it like that. You really find out about it. Came back, started working again, and the following Christmas, that was 1959, Phyllis came up from New York. She'd been working in the East Harlem Protestant Parish and had been to Mexico with the Quakers. And she had an English friend whom she'd met in East Harlem. And she was she'd gone to Stanford for 2 years. Her mother said, you've got to come back and go to New York. And so she was in between schools. She was actually at Columbia's girls' school, I forgot. And she came up one weekend skiing that following Christmas, and we fell in love, and we went back to England. And she said that there is no way I'm going to live and work in this country. She just thought it was absolute hell on wheels. And I didn't want to go back either, but I thought she ought to see where I came from. And so we came back, and that spring, about May, we were married. So there we were, the two of us. And then 1 year from that, the Sarkas had incorporated as a non-profit tax-exempt corporation. And the first job of their friends, who were the first board of trustees, was basically to fire them. They said, Wayne, we think you need a sabbatical, and we want you to take off for 6 months, and go and enjoy yourself. And he realized after the meeting was over that they were really saying, oh, leave. So then the chase was on, and who was going to run the ranch? So they finally asked their daughter, Anne, who was, she was following an art career at Columbia, but anyway, in New York. And she said, well, I'll start out, but I'm not prepared to be director. She was only 29 or so, and I was 28. No, she must have been 30, I was about 28. And their cousin, Ray Sergin, who was also Finnish extraction, had always been the farmer of the place. He ran the outdoor program. So Anne said, I'll be one of 3 directors. So we formed what they call a troika. And the 3 of us ran it for 2 years. And during that time, we were looking for a new director. And this is where John Thompson comes in. I was pretty much given the job of doing all the books and finding out just how badly in debt we were. And to some extent the work program, and to some extent counseling with young people and so on. But also looking for a new director. And that took me all kinds of interesting places. One was this Bishop of Western Massachusetts, who was the first person to say, well, why don't you do it? And I said, oh, God, I have no experience, I don't have a degree, and I'm not trained, and I'm too young. Well, he said, never mind, that's my recommendation. I don't have anyone to recommend to you. And then the second person was the father of our consulting psychiatrist. And parallel to this, I've been thinking I was going to become an Episcopal minister. And so Rosenstock-Huessy, who was the father of arts and psychiatrist, said, well, you can't do that without my teaching you. He was teaching at Dartmouth, and he was a theologian and historian who knew people like Martin Buber and Tillich and Bonhoeffer and so on, because he was involved in the camps that Hitler turned into the Hitler Youth. They were camps started, I think, by Dagmar Benz for blue-collar workers and students and perhaps white-collar workers. And he had an incredible experience in World War I, too, fighting at Verdun as a cavalry officer.
Sorry, could you give me his name again?
Yeah, it's Rosenstock.
Oh, yes,
Huessy, Huessy. His actual name was Huessy, but his wife's name was Rosenstock, and I think in Germany or Switzerland they take the wife's name. So I went over, not every week, but most weeks, in the evening, and he lectured to me to prepare me for going to what they call the old man's canon that allows people over 26 to become priests or ministers, in spite of the fact that they haven't been to university. And that was ongoing, and then I was given the name of John Thompson as yet another person to go and interview. And I think, as I wrote to you, we met in New York, and he wasn't interested, but he was interested in the ranch, and he also had some extremely good suggestions to make, one of which was a man who subsequently became another very good friend and another theologian, another Finn, who emigrated to this country with his children and became one of our trustees and eventually went on to Waterloo.
What was his name?
His name is Arne Sierla. That's Arnesierla.
And could you just tell me who made the recommendation to John, to see John Thompson?
That was, there is a sister, so they're nothing to do with us, but there are two places like the ranch. One is called Gould Farm in Great Barrington, Mass. It's actually older than the ranch. Started by a minister, about 20 years before the ranch started. And the then director at Gould Farm was a friend of mine. I mean, I became friends because we did the same thing, and I thought, good to know what people in the field were thinking, doing. So I went to him and said, we're looking for a director, and do you have any suggestions? And he somehow knew of John Thompson.
And what's the opposite to institution?
Gould Farm.
Yeah, Gould Farm, and you said that's the only one.
That's the only one. Springlake and Gould Farm.
Okay.
At that time.
Yeah.
So then really life went on, and Anne Sarker left because she wasn't really what she wanted to do, and that left me more or less running the ranch from an administrative and financial and increasingly I did the part of it that wasn't the farm. But still also worked outside and did sugaring and paint and everything, because it's a very small place, or was then particularly, a very small place. And Ray Searching stayed until he retired, and he was 25 years older than I am, so he was sort of phasing out, and that left me as the sole director. But for a long time, Ray and I were the two directors, and he was like Dad, and I was like Mom. I'm a bit of a softie, and I have a hard time saying no, and Ray was very good at saying no and took the traditional male role. But we were a very effective team, I think, for many, many years. And the place grew, and there was never a problem with money, because it very quickly became solvent, and we had no difficulties there.
Could you just explain, people who come to live with you,
yes,
they're recommended by psychiatrists?
Well, it's changed over time, but in those days it was fairly exclusively recommended by psychiatrists, occasionally social workers, but often because that's the way America was then, there were two parallel systems. There was a private system and the state system. And the state system was state hospitals for the indigent, for people who really run out of money or whatever. And the private system was these very Bronx State, for instance, Brooklyn, there were lots of them, Manhattan State Hospital. The private system was places like McLean's, Chestnut Lodge, Bloomingdale's, Menninger's, prestigious big institutions, and both tended to be what one might call tertiary treatment centers, in the sense that they took people who clearly were chronically mentally ill. If it was just a sort of blow-up from which there were no repercussions and nothing ever happened again, those people fed back into life and they were fine one way or another. But for anyone with an illness that kept recurring, and particularly psychosis, schizophrenia or whatever, they tended to spend much of their lives in either system. Often they'd start in the private one if they have money and use it all up and end up in the state one. So hospitals, sometimes directors of hospitals, mostly private, of course, because we had a rate fee which was modest in those days, but still much more than poor people could afford. They call up and say, we've got this person we've had for 2 years, who's been in here five times in the last 5 years, and he's going no place, and we think maybe a different approach would be useful. And I always thought of the British Armament system for fee paying, so I set the rate above what it cost, so that people who came and had money, we put into the excess into a scholarship fund, which made us able to take people who didn't have very much money. It wasn't perfect, but it ended up always being a pretty sort of middle or upper middle class clientele. But I always thought it was important to try and have it as mixed as possible. Well, that began to change when Kennedy came in, because he was the driving force between Action for Mental Health, which is a piece of legislation that drastically changed the way treatment was given out, and started off by providing federal monies for mental health treatment and care through community mental health centers, of which in Vermont there were 11. And this, of course, was also Medicaid, Medicare, and so on, which would fund people who were indigent. Again, federal. So from having patients at the state hospital whose fee, if you like, or cost was estimated at $4.50 a day because they ran the hospital, ran the laundry, the farm associated with it. The emphasis then was on deinstitutionalization. The costs began to rise. The unions didn't like having patients work for next to nothing. So that whole system began changing, and it became much less long-term, and costs, because they started escalating, pushed the length of stay shorter and shorter. And then what also happened was that with this terrific pressure to close the state mental hospitals or shorten lengths of stay, a pretty good proportion of people who were long-term patients in state hospitals and so on ended up on the streets or in prisons. So our prisons have many, some people estimate as many as a third of the occupants of our prisons are people who in another age would have been in the state hospital. And the private system, which stayed pretty intact because there's so much money in this country, even that began a rather radical change. And that was partially because of medications. This is my opinion, I could be totally wrong on this, but medications interrupted a kind of love affair this country had with analysis. Most of the teaching hospitals were run by analysts, and taught analysis is the kind of prime and desired method of treatment. But of course it was terribly expensive. It meant that people in the private hospitals stayed forever getting analysis or analytically oriented treatment. And then there was more and more pressure for those hospitals to say, well, look, these drugs work very well to control symptoms. And some of them even closed down because they were refused, and the medical profession or patient parents. Never mind, it's too complicated. But that was another pressure, the fact that the treatment was beginning to become more and more pharmacologically oriented.
You date this from when, right?
Well, I'd say it sort of began getting momentum in the mid-70s. Yeah. It started, Thorazine was actually, we had our first people on Thorazine, and doctors were absolutely horrified that our psychiatrists would use it, back in 1958. But it took a long time for it to become, and of course the earlier drugs were incredibly unpleasant. The side effects were sometimes worse than the symptoms they were trying to ameliorate. So anyway, the population, especially in the 70s and before Vietnam began chewing into the federal budget, our population really began shifting down socioeconomically, and we would have policemen's sons from New York City, or schools, public schools would pay for someone to come to us, or there was just a great deal more money in the system, and it was really Johnson's and following Kennedy, the height of the benefits of the social programs that administration had. Well, then Vietnam began eating up all the money. The whole country began reassessing its values, and the shift began to a much more right-wing, throw people in jail and leave them there, and punishment's the answer, and if you're mentally ill, you're probably lazy and you deserve whatever you get. And the whole aspect of a charitable country, to my way of thinking, began changing. It became a much more hard-bitten society in terms of. However, treatments got better and better, and so particularly for things like schizophrenia, as each class of drugs was perfected, more and more people who, prior to 1950, spent most of their lives in hospital with the medications, which only controlled symptoms, never cured, meant that those people could be rehabilitated to a higher level than the living in a hospital. So our job was always to have people come and with whatever treatment our consultant psychiatrist, Hans Huessy, could provide medically. He saw his role as very limited. So I'm just treating symptoms. I'm doing whatever I can to help these people not be overwhelmed by their voices or their depression or their whatever. So you're doing the real work. And he didn't have any part to play in running the place or and studiously avoided having his name associated as, well, of course, who's running the ranch or who's the real director of the ranch. He wouldn't allow that. And he had much more faith in us than we did in ourselves. Yeah.
You've gone for theological training from Susie Farmer.
Yes.
And then was it you who brought out Susie? Was that the link?
Hans Huessy actually suggested that I go and see his dad.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he didn't want me to do it either. Hans Huessy, he said, if that's what you want to do, go ahead, but you're doing, what else can you do? You're doing it all. You're never going to have anything better to do than what you're doing right now. And he was always a bit of someone who doesn't toe the line in this. He wasn't that enamored of psychiatrists. He thought they were often pretty self-serving, and I think he felt that frequently people who had no particular ladder to climb or hierarchy to be involved in could be more effective working with ill people than not, than those who had lots of training and so on. So he also felt that our model, which was really based on living life, not dealing with illness, was, to him, just made such good sense. Now even back then, there were people like John Thompson's friends who were part of the Henderson group in Scotland, who would really be trying to do some of the same things. And some of them were considered outrageous, some of them were had almost guru-like followings. But there were people who were listening, who were excited and interested in the possibilities of alternatives along these sort of rough lines of the ranch, very rough. And in the 70s, a whole mess of mostly kind of residential facilities opened up, particularly in cities, in Washington, Boston, run sometimes by students, sometimes by social workers who just thought the system was lousy. So, in a way, Gould Farm and the ranch were kind of granddaddies who had been around. And our programs are very different because we really were total programs. All these others didn't have work programs. They had medical components usually, but they were really residences for people to live instead of them being in hospitals. Now, so the reason I didn't pursue the religious thing was because I had these three people, Hans Huessy's father and this bishop in Massachusetts, and then John Thompson, who was really the one who finally convinced me. Well, I wouldn't say he was the one, but he was one of the three who convinced me, why don't you do it? And I was pretty hesitant because I just had never had a huge amount of self-confidence. But I was doing it anyway, so that's the way it happened. And my wife is a very strong person who was also, she was a can-do person. I tend to suffer from depression, and she doesn't.
Your wife is also involved in this?
Well, she wasn't. When our children were little, she And we felt it was very important for her not to be, because the mistake we felt the psychiatrists made was that they were husband and wife. And the power that that represented was out of proportion. So throughout our children's formative years, until they were beginning to go away to private school, she was mum at home, and she played around with the idea of, well, she finished her degree, and she was more and more involved in town activities, school board, arts councils, and she loves being on boards. She's a very good board member, and that's what she did. But then we finally needed desperately a bookkeeper. And she wasn't a bookkeeper, but it just seemed like that was a good idea. But she and I agreed that she wouldn't have any part in what we call branch meetings, any part in working directly with the residents, wouldn't come to staff meetings. Again, because we were afraid of, I was perceived as fairly powerful in spite of all my anxieties. With her, it would have been an absolute hospital. So, but then for the last 10 or 12, I don't know how many years it was, at least 10, she did work with me, and so we were both working, and the kids, of course, by that time in school.
Could you say something about how people live at Springlake, and what the range of disturbances that people have that brings them there, and how the place is beneficial for them?
It's undoubtedly changing all the time to some degree, but I'll give you the best answer I can. It has always provided an opportunity for chronically mentally ill people with almost any degree of severity, but not actively psychotic or suicidal. So that about half the population, most of the time I was there, and at least from a third to a half had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, or later as time went on it was schizoaffective disorder or manic depressive illness. I mean, the trouble is all these things go together and the names keep changing. So schizophrenia, manic depressive illness, borderline, which used to be sociopath, character disorder, anorexia, and then brain damage, epilepsy, mild retardation. We really had the gamut, but those other ones, it was usually 1 or 2, 3, 4 people at a time that had often multiple diagnoses. So, and of course substance abuse was a big part of almost everybody, not everybody, but after the change from long-term institutionalization to less long-term institutionalization or short-term institution care and treatment, the incidence of alcoholism and drug addiction rose markedly because people treated themselves with alcohol and drugs. So we always had to have the two components. We had to gradually become more sophisticated, using mostly AA meetings away from us for that, for treatment of that side of it. But the range was enormous. We first of all had an average age of 26, but we had people as young as 18, occasionally even younger, illegally, and as old as 70. As long as a person could navigate that territory, that terrain, they were welcome to come. But the majority were always in their 20s, late teens, early 20s. When I came, we had a lot of sort of switchblade and a knife delinquent kind of kids. And that, again, growing less, but then it became more again during the late 70s. And those kids really weren't mentally ill as much as they were slow to mature and needed longer to grow up, and we were a relatively safe environment for them to do that. We also had another unique capability. Huessy did most of his lifetime research and work with children. He was originally a pediatrician and then a child psychiatrist and then an adult psychiatrist. And with children, he had developed the idea that there was such a thing as hyperkinesis or attention deficit disorder. Now, this was long before it became a common word. And he felt that a lot of the people we saw, especially those that were called borderline or sociopathic or and so on, were ADD. And he began treating those people with very small amounts of dexedrine and Ritalin, and then later on with small amounts of antidepressants, with quite remarkable results sometimes. Again, you couldn't do that in an outpatient setting because you couldn't monitor it. But the combination of his attempts to find drugs that help people be less impulsive and our ability to absorb the change that occurred in people during that swing period worked very well. So we didn't only have just chronic mentally ill, drooling people. We had people who went on to live damn good lives. Quite a few. I mean, many. Yeah, there were a few other things. When the Vietnam War was on, we had quite a few people from Vietnam after it. People who suffered post-traumatic stress disorder and so on. And that was a period when the youth were challenging the institutions worldwide in the West. And that was exciting because we were all pretty young and we thought we were part of it. And so we did things like open all the filing cabinets, and we didn't really have any locks anywhere anyway. But the residents themselves said, no, don't unlock them, but why don't, we had what we call town meetings in the mornings every month. And everybody is one vote. Everybody. Cook, everybody. And at those meetings, some very fundamental changes were voted in. One was that records would be accessible to residents, their records. But they would also participate in their own record keeping. That they would attend meetings with the staff who were meeting with Dr. Huessy. Now, again, it was a selective thing. I mean, only one or so at a time. But that they voted, there was a resident always at any staff meeting and any meeting. And of course, that raises confidentiality issues and everything like that. But it was all incredibly exciting. And we were all the time, we were trying to push responsibility down as far as we could push it. So that was one way to do it, was to demystify the doctor, to demystify the staff, to have residents listen to a doctor struggling with, well, what are we going to do about so-and-so? And then we had an ombudsman system where a resident who was seeing Dr. Huessy, asked to see him to talk about their medicines or whatever, would have another resident present at the meeting who could say, hey, Charlie, you haven't been not sleeping. You sleep damn well most. I mean, it was a check and a balance. But that participation by everybody in every aspect of life, work leaders were often chosen from within the resident group. A council of 4 residents and 2 staff decided on all the recreation activities.
This would be in the early 70s?
Yeah. We, in a way, we started doing that even in the 60s, but it accelerated in the 70s. It was just trying to have the focus, instead of having it patient staff, we wanted it to be old, young, men, women, strong, weak, politically liberal, politically conservative. We wanted the dialogue to get mixed up so that it wouldn't always fall into this, oh, he's sick, he's starved, and so on. And go ahead.
Your patients lived in small...
Well, mostly, we have about, I think there were 9 living units. Some were tiny cottages, 1 staff, 2 residents. Some were 2 staff, 5 residents. A total of 30 residents, a total of 30 staff. Many of the staff living in the cottages were people like I was when I first came, but as time went on, they were Antioch students, Antioch College, Beloit in Wisconsin sent students. Then that seemed a little too young, and we began advertising in the AmeriCorps, which is the job program that exists in this country, but more particularly in the Peace Corps magazine of those returning from the Peace Corps, and a huge proportion of people came through the Peace Corps. I was also very anxious to have people from other countries, so just wherever we had a contact in another country, England, Germany, France, Australia, and if possible a third world country that didn't have very often, we welcomed students to come and work for a summer. And sometimes they'd come 2 summers, and sometimes they'd come for a winter, or for 2 years, or whatever. They were always short-term, but they were just fabulous because they introduced yet another helpful difference. We had a wonderful woman from Southampton who was a social worker in the prison system, and she was just many, and then an 80-year-old woman who'd been a German woman who lived in Italy during World War II. She'd come in the summers, and she was grandma. She lived in one of the cottages, and again, she was a different kind of a person, so that to us, rules we kept to the absolute minimum that we could. And the reason that we felt we could do that was because at every meal there were people of both sexes, all ages, well, sort of well, sick, very sick, and babies and children. We loved having staff who had babies or had little children, and all our children were there. And I ate every breakfast all my life there, and every lunch, and I'd usually go home for dinner, but one night a week my family would come up as well. Well, some families had most of their dinners there, so it meant that you didn't need to tell people not to swear or not to shout, because they wouldn't do it with an 80-year-old woman sitting opposite them, or with a baby, or a 2-year-old. An enormous amount of the behavioral problems that living with quite disturbed people can bring forth just didn't exist.
Did you take an interest in these accountabilities?
Yes. Yes, because they're for developmentally disabled people. But I used to go down to the Kopek Steiner place, and there was a woman who ran that at that time, was an English woman, who was in Hellenistic, I think, for some time. And we were good friends, and I loved what they were doing. They were more socialist, if you like, or more godly or Christ-like than we were. They had a religious underpinning that we really didn't, and they shared everything, and they shared salaries, they shared much more than we did. We still were fairly conventional in many respects. But what we discovered over time was that there was that developmentally disabled people, that the environment was too stimulating, and there wasn't enough structure. So that the lack of structure was wonderful for taking kids who were crazy and all that. Well, that sounds like a contradiction in terms. They needed structure, but a different kind of structure. And they had to have freedom to express themselves and be who they were, and their kind of way of being in the community was pretty threatening to retarded kids. They were sexually much more active. You know, that was the one thing we never bridged satisfactorily, was to be able to take very retarded people and have them live with our population. It just didn't work. But many of the same attributes that I think Camp Hill had certainly worked very well for us too. That was what I was always doing, going around, was trying to figure out how other people did what they did and what would work with us and what wouldn't. And of course, John Thompson spoke endlessly of Eau Vive because to him that was the ideal, that was the place that, and I listened and tried to reinterpret what he said into the ranch and so on. He would refer people, and I'm sorry I'm rambling all over the place. One day he said, I've got this patient, he's in a private hospital in Westchester County, and I don't think he belongs there, and I want to go down and try and get him out. And you come with me. So I went down, we went to this place, and we walked in, and they wouldn't see us, but finally the director came out on a balcony and sort of shouted down, what do you want? John said, well, we've come to see if it's possible for, I think his name was Barry, I'm not sure, but anyway, whatever this guy's name was, to make a move. And after all, he's my patient, says John. You know, I mean, in the sense, he's not any longer his patient because he's in that institution, but he was prior to that, John's patient. And this director just sort of dismissed us, and John was horrified. He just thought, you know, he said, well, that's how not to run an institution. It was just a moment in time, and you know, God knows, probably we didn't have a what do you call it, a scheduled appointment. I don't know any of the details, but it was classically John to introduce people to us. Almost all the people he referred were interesting. They were often artistic in one way or another, and far from all very, very ill. Some of them were not. And that was another feature of the ranch when I was there, was really quite wonderful, because there were people like Steve and John, and there was another guy at New York Hospital, and there was a guy in Boston. They thought we were the cat's whiskers, and so they would refer people who were just what I call screwed up. Young people in a mess, either with the law or with drugs or alcohol. And sometimes they felt that they didn't want them to get into the hospital system and be thought and begin to think of themselves as mentally ill. And of course, a lot of those people would come, and very quickly, they were practically, I mean, we were talking to them about, well, we'd like to employ you. Now, we had a rule later on that you had to leave first and work for a few months, and then we'd employ you. But we had actors, painters, whatever, playwright, we had ones who, I shouldn't use too many plurals because these people are a minority in the population, but they were incredibly vibrant souls who gave the place such a wonderful spirit.
Artistic.
Yeah.
Spirit. Mine doing manual agriculture.
Yeah, which of course was why most of them never wanted to come, but once they got there, some of them really took to the animals, or that was always a struggle, because who the hell wants to go to Vermont, live with a bunch of crazy people, and collect maple syrup? But if they got over that hurdle, many of them ended up just in love with the place, and still are some of them.
And what's the
day-to-day?
Yes. What's the theory behind doing manual work if you're mentally?
Well, it starts with, all right, so you're ill. You've got a diagnosis. What else about you is there? You're tall, you're strong, you're weak, you're whatever. You seem to be awfully good at remembering things that have to be done tomorrow, or whatever little talent we could identify in the course of living very close together, sharing as much as we try to capitalize on. And what we were saying to everybody was, this is a community. Everybody has to contribute in any community or family in order for it to work. It doesn't matter how simple, it doesn't matter how mundane or it might seem to you, it's valuable to us. And we want your contribution. So that the reason it was physical was because we really saw an association between using your body and clearing your mind. It's simply the tiredness you feel at the end of the day, having worked physically outdoors, is the kind of tiredness that induces sleep, that is sort of free, relatively, of demons. You're just plain tired. Your body says, I want to sleep. And many of the people who left, when we asked in questionnaires sometimes, try and get some sense of whether anything we did was worth anything, what made a difference? We'd expect to hear all the Dr. Hughes' pills, or it was wonderful conversations I had with you. And they'd say, it was when you said, would you help me, bring this cart into the world? Or when you said, take the path from this building to this building, and it's all muddy, and make it a path that you can walk on, and it won't be muddy anymore. Which meant finding stores of gravel and wheelbarrows and spraying it, and it was always things like that that people said made a difference. You trusted me enough to do something that was valuable to the place. So it's their ownership. And we also tried to get to the point where, with families, whom we talked to a great deal, and I used to anyway, it's not, you didn't send your child, I know you're paying for it, but this is their place. If you want to come and see them, they've got to ask you. It was all giving back a sense of pride, a sense of, this is my experience, this is my place, no matter how primitive that might be. And physical work, of course, is work that almost anybody can do.
So the sorts of things you were doing was general farm work, maple syrup,
ice cutting. This is partially because that's the way in New England ice used to be cut out of our lake and shipped to Boston by train. Ice cutting is chunks 3 feet by 3 feet by 2 feet and put in a nice house and stored for the summer for refrigeration. Pain, animal care, construction. We try always to build as much of any new building or renovation as we possibly can. A lot of times we have to get professional help. Fixing vehicles, preparing meals, canning, bottling, freezing vegetables from our vegetable garden, laundry, anything that makes a community run. And we all, if I was on duty on a Sunday, I vacuumed and cleaned the jobs, even when I was director. So that nothing was beneath any of us. We would all pitch in to do anything that had to be done. Even when the end, when the place got so goddamn complicated and full of this, that, and that, I tried to get out on the work program one day every week or one day every 2 weeks, and work on a truck with somebody, with a resident who, to fix it up for the haying or whatever, or just join a crew that was collecting sap or hay, because we wanted people to feel that no work was any less or more dignified than any other kind of work. And what really was key to it, a lot of it, recreation is also incredibly important, and it's a much more difficult thing to build into something like that. But there again, we try and have, if we had a softball, fairly good group of softball players, we'd play the local jail, or we'd take canoe trips down a river in Maine, or I took a busload of people to an ice hockey game in Montreal, or camping was a big thing, taking people out in groups to camp or to climb or to... but the physical part was always stressed. And the other part, of course, was artistic. At different times we'd have an orchestra or a band, or at least a few people who played the guitar, and music also was unbelievable, and pottery and art. But those depended a lot on residents coming with those particular skills or staff members coming with those particular skills.
Well, what I would like to ask you is, I would like you to just remember your meetings with John and the sort of things he said and
Yes.
he did and so on.
Yeah.
And how often did he visit?
Only about 3 times. I met him in New York more often than he came up. And in total, I doubt I met him more than, say, 8 or 9 or maybe 10 or 11 times. But boy, they were a mixture of business, a patient whom he wanted to describe, whom he wanted to have come, and then wandering off into points at which his life experience was clearly something I'd understand. It was often, I guess in retrospect, much of it was centered around the idea of trying to maintain the dignity of people by recognizing their talents and by nurturing their assets, rather than getting bogged down in their illnesses. And the anecdotes, the spy in Rutland and that, I'm not going to remember things so well, I'm sure, but the stories of the Nuremberg trials and being a psychiatrist in the British Army toward the end of the war, and Eau Vive, which he would light up. It was so exciting to him that place existed in the form that it existed. And I honestly felt it was like the key point in his life experience. Maybe it wasn't, but it seemed that way. It seemed like it was the most wonderful period of his life. And not so, some about his teaching here, but I may have got the university wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was Bryn Mawr, it might have been. He kind of enjoyed shocking people too.
Was he teaching in Pennsylvania?
Yeah. I mean, he clearly got quite a charge out of the administration's reaction to his taking these girls down the line. And he liked that.
There was a pre-med.
Probably. Yeah, I don't honestly know. I'm not even sure they were med students, but maybe they were. I think one of the most memorable times when we really almost said nothing, but it was watching Churchill's funeral live, because what his memories must have been, of course, were legion compared to what mine had been. But it was enormously comforting to be there with him. I don't know many English people in this country, and my life in England is sort of a closed book. So to be with someone who literally understood, there are times when it's very nice to be with an English person.
So John is an Englishman to you?
Maybe he isn't, but that's the way. I know he was educated in Scotland and so forth. I don't know where he was born. He could. I shouldn't say English. I should say British Isles. But
did he talk about his school education?
No, never.
No, right. So that when you say education in Scotland,
that was later.
Edinburgh.
That was Edinburgh.
Edinburgh.
Yeah. And then Mexico? I'm not sure where that fits in, but
after Edinburgh, he was teaching at Swarthmore at the same time as completing his medical studies in Scotland.
Okay. In Scotland? Well, when did he go to Mexico?
Medical degree.
Yes, I knew that, but I thought he had some period of time in Mexico.
He talked about Mexico.
Yeah.
What did he say?
Just that he was there. I think it came up because we were talking. I'd been to Mexico fairly, close to that time, and I don't remember what he said. Mexico City, and in my head it was that there were. It goes together with this Henderson group, time-wise at least. And I never could figure out, because I had some misgivings about that group of people, and I could never figure out how intimately involved with that group he was. Because they all went their separate ways. They all were very powerful, different people.
This was in Edinburgh in the 30s or the 50s?
No, this was in the 50s.
In the 50s. Yeah. Did he talk about his time in child guidance?
No.
In Oxford?
He talked, well, he certainly, I knew he was familiar with Oxford. No, he didn't talk about Oxford.
Okay. Did he talk about, tell me what he said about the war.
Well, not a lot about the bulk of the war. It was mostly from being with the British Army in the last stages of the war, and the kind of absolute chaos, and the camps. I'm not sure, but I have a feeling he had something to do with one of the. This I get mixed up with because the Hugheses were very involved with Auschwitz, and I think he was involved with Belsen in some way, but I don't. And I was always very moved by that all because in high school we had another old Hillary, Lord Oaksey, who was one of the presiding judges, I think, at the Nuremberg trial, and another one of the I don't think he was a general, but he might have been a major general, who was one with the first unit that went into Belsen, who came back to our school, this was Hartlebury, and showed a documentary that had been made by the first soldiers to go in. And I can remember describing that to John, and he just nodded. I wasn't telling him that he didn't know, obviously. It resonated. But he didn't elaborate. I mean, he didn't go into any detail. I was only, 13 or something.
Do you have a sense of why he didn't talk anymore about? You mentioned that going to Belgium was so important to him, but not...
Well, this is one of the undercurrents that I felt with John, was that he contained an enormous amount of suffering, and that I almost felt I didn't want to add to it in any way.
So he would have to be that it was
yeah, and I don't know that I really thought this. Maybe this is one of these things you think later, and I'm always suspicious of things you think later, I think later. But I a little bit felt that part of my role was to make him feel better, when he was down, because he seemed so down sometimes. Now, I didn't think that at the time. This is a thought that I just sort of, what I'm remembering is how sometimes when I was with him, he wouldn't talk. He just sat in the car, and then other times he just talked.
Is that, was that always the case with John, or was that something that became this theme of this healthy spirit and containing suffering? Is that something which struck you as more and more in the...
It didn't in the beginning at all. The first time it happened was he'd come up to the ranch, and I think I described in the letter that he lay on the lawn and sort of soaked it up. And then he suddenly said, I've got to be in New York, and the train leaves from Whitehall at such and such. I said, oh my God, we're not going to make it. So he said, we'll try. So I drove him like hell, and he was almost silent. But he was silent on that entire trip. I didn't know whether because I always assume that they don't like, I thought he didn't like the ranch, or he didn't like his time up there, or something. I assumed it was my problem. But I afterwards felt he just wasn't a very happy person.
But this was really as long as you knew him?
No, this was after this, I'd say halfway into knowing him. I began feeling, I was so in awe of him that I didn't even think about what he thought or felt. But as time went on, I began feeling that there just were, that there was a sadness there. And it also was when he had a patient who was from Boston who adored him, and we were in New York again, and this boy, man, and we were just talking about him, but there were times with him when it just felt that he was beginning to float away, putting it too dramatically. There was just something big on his mind that I couldn't, but then, why the hell should I?
You never had an insight into what could be you.
No, I had none whatever. Well, he also, there's another thing that never got resolved. And I felt he was, it's the whole Catholic thing and the whole psychiatry thing. I was kind of aware that he was quite Catholic, not quite very Catholic, and I wasn't. And I remember being very surprised at how religious he was. And my religion had begun sort of decaying. Or not so much my religion, but I began to become more, as I have done, more and more critical of religions, the churches, the structures, Episcopalianism or Buddhism or Catholicism or Judaism, it doesn't matter. The institutional structures bother me more and more and more. And I realized I was not nearly as, I almost used the word holy, as I thought he was. And then in psychiatry, I realized as time went on how strong the analytical training he had had as a young person must have been. And of course he was of that generation. And I'd got Dr. Huessy, who was also pretty much of that generation, younger, but who had philosophically and spiritually decided that analysis was bad. He was very... So we had this, and I had to reconcile the two of them to each other because they often were treating the same patient.
So he was in favor of analysis?
Well, I wouldn't say it quite that way. He just had a lot of the same qualities that most of the people who refer people to us who are analytically trained had. A kind of faith in, I guess, searching within oneself for the truth. And Hans Huessy was much more weary of ill people dwelling on their illness too much.
Did John meet her?
Yes, once. Yeah, not so that any particular dialogue could have taken place. They were just in the same place at the same time. And that was when we had what we called our annual meeting, where we invited important trustees, people. We had a speaker, and our speaker was John, and Hans was in the audience.
So John was the speaker. Do you know when this was?
Oh, gosh. It had to be like 1960. Oh, gosh. I'm guessing at this stage. 63 or something. I could be off by 5 years. Not 5, by 3 years probably.
You know what John said?
He talked about Eau Vive.
What did he say?
Well, he described it, and as being, and he said, and I feel that the ranch tries to do many of the things that.
How did he describe it?
Eau Vive? I can't separate how he told me about it outside the framework of that meeting from that meeting. I can't remember that well.
All right. I mean, tell me in general.
Well, in general, that here was a community like the ranch that was accepting of people regardless of anything, regardless of their previous status, condition, whatever, that attempted to be safe, nurturing, and in a sense non-intrusive, allowing people to just be, and that made no distinctions between people. That was one of the key things, always. No distinctions between who you were or how important you were or how sick you were or anything. It's just simply you were a person worthy of dignity and so on, and worthy of being treated with dignity. And then, of course, he would always liken it to, or talk about the fact that it evolved from looking at the way that the Nazis had run their concentration camps and sort of thinking, well, what's the opposite of that?
So what is the opposite of it?
Well, no records was the thing that I always remembered. Probably much more than that, but that was the thing that struck me at the time, that, you don't count, measure things. You don't stack up the reasons a person's there or what their religious, sexual, age attributes are. They just are there.
Right. The whole person.
The whole person is there, and that of course everybody should be treated equally. Everybody. And I think that's what, as much as anything, we strive to do is to not have a we-they dichotomy.
Did he say anything about the origins of Eau Vive?
Only that he was in Paris, that I don't even remember who was with him or what his group was, but he was in Paris. They met this, well, I even think they found the place before they met the woman, but anyway, that may be wrong. There was this big chateau that was empty, and the owner they found, as I remember it, she was an old French lady, and they asked her and persuaded her to have it used in this way, and she agreed.
As a therapeutic use?
Well, I don't think they even described it that way. I think it was as a place for stateless people.
As a refuge place?
Yeah. Because he said after the war there just was so many people roaming around who really had no tie, nothing, no place to go, no family to return to, no nothing, no money.
Jewish, or they from camps?
Well, my understanding was they were mostly from camps. They weren't necessarily all Jewish, but they were certainly from camps. And of course, by inference, that means they probably were Jewish. But no, they weren't, because, you know, he had, and I don't know why they were there, but he had a lot of the people who, I think they were visitors mostly, but, you know, apparently Pope John came by, and there were others that, he said quite a number of important people. I'm not going to go into that. No, no. Would it be Strauss? You know, the European, remember, is it Strauss who, the Union, the European Union? No, I don't remember.
And did he say anything about the end of Eau Vive?
No. Well, no, he didn't. In my head, and I don't know whether he gave this impression or I manufactured it, it ceased to be necessary to have it. The people, I don't even know how many years it went on, but people were picked up by the various agencies and institutions that were supposed to be dealing with them in the first place. You know, the need for it disappeared.
And this would have been in 45?
Yes, I think it had to have been 45 because it was right after the war. You know what I should do?
I'm not looking at the time at all. What do you say about his military service, his war service?
Well, not a lot except that he was with the British Army, that he was in some way a psychiatrist. Still, I mean, that was why he was there. And not really much at all. It's just that toward the end, the chaos was unbelievable.
You talk about Canada.
Canada?
Yes.
Not that I recall.
And when you were watching Churchill's funeral,
yes,
did he talk about anything to do with any contact with Churchill or people who knew Churchill?
If he did, I don't remember.
There is one who comes to mind, and that was someone called Lord Moran, who was Churchill's doctor.
Oh, we don't see that friend?
Who John commissioned this process up, was shared by Moran.
Really?
And there is a book with a dedication, but he didn't mention anything that Moran, his name, he didn't mention, because that's his...
You know, he might have. It was so, we were emotionally so drained by it. My only memory really is sitting in his apartment watching and barely saying anything. No, he might have, but I don't recall it.
So you watched it in Riverdale?
Yes.
And you also visited him in King Street? Or just in Riverdale?
I think very often we didn't meet, most of the times we met in New York it was at a restaurant. Or at a hospital, or, at a hospital or whatever. I didn't know he was on King Street.
Did you talk about any other deaths, Kennedy or anything like that?
I don't recall.
Civil rights?
You know, the one thing that, I've got to be careful on this, because the one thing that you touched something there, that the civil rights workers who went down to, where was it, Mississippi, I think he knew one of them. Lerner, was it? Or Michael Lerner? That's a guess. But I believe he did know about that. And because we talk about some of these things, but we just talk about them, the way you do when you read a newspaper or whatever. But my recollection is that he knew one of those three men.
Who did he put you in touch with in terms of introducing you to
other people?
Yeah.
Well, I'm pretty sure Joseph. A whole bunch of patients, not a huge number, but a group of patients. And as I say,
the other clinicians?
No, I don't believe so. Because his referrals were always incredibly personal referrals. I don't recall him saying, this person has a doctor whose name is so-and-so who's also involved. I don't recall that. It was always, the only person I ever talked to about his patients was John. I don't recall him having other doctors. I'm sure many of them did, or went on to other doctors or whatever.
Did you say anything about the treatment of Einstein? Well, I mean, it would have been a because...
Now, I don't know how this got started, but I'll bet he had something to do with it. Because why else would it have started? But at Einstein, at Bronx, I'm pretty sure that at Bronx State, he must have introduced someone to us, or they began sending, not very often, patients to the ranch in a small group for a weekend getaway. And at Einstein, I went to Einstein with him once. I have a feeling it was to meet one of his patients. I also, in those days, I used to talk at different places, and I don't think he was the one who ever asked me to do that. I talked at Pain Whitney Clinic and at Claims and so on, but he wasn't that associated. He was mostly Einstein, but I think he had a connection at Bronx State.
Did you talk about the cancer?
Yeah. Well, only that we all know it. He had some not very nice to say about a lot of the private institutions here, but no.
He never spoke about experiences,
no.
Okay. And did he speak about tuberculosis?
No, which is odd because that was a problem I had. No, that never came up.
But you hear what was the Rutland statement?
I'm sorry?
The Rutland statement, it was Massachusetts, but decided to run on. That's what the geography like.
Well, Vermont's above Massachusetts.
Yeah, but it just says Rutland.
Rutledge?
Rutland. Like the English.
Like the English Rutland. Well, there's a town called Rutland near us, of course, but there's no institution. No. You mean, did he mention the town?
Well, there was a Rutland, there was a big Rutland in Vermont, a large state from Buber, where he actually spent time as an inpatient for the CD, most of it.
Is that right? What an extraordinary... No, I don't know.
He never mentioned it.
He never mentioned it.
He never talked about what it's like to be
a place like that.
Yeah.
Isn't that extraordinary? No, he didn't.
What was his idea in sending Joseph and Offer here in Chamonix out to Springlake? What did he think they would get them? It sounds rather out of the blue.
You know, we have a very funny relationship to Joseph and Offer, and I can't honestly remember how it all began. I believe that Joseph was a patient of his. I'm pretty sure that's true. My wife might remember that, but I can't remember. Of course, he was teaching. We saw them as two people that we were interested in who were friends. He might have had another motive in mind, I don't know. But we enjoyed them enormously. We had a period where we were quite close, and then we sort of drifted apart. And just from, I don't know, it was sort of, I think, a realm of gossip in a way, but like so many of us, for Ofra, that was a difficult time, and he's had enough difficulties that that's been a hard marriage, to sustain and so on, as far as we can tell. I don't mean they don't love each other or anything like that, but he really gets down. And whether John felt that something might coalesce around the ranch that would be helpful to, because I can't.
They visited him several
Yes, oh sure, they came and stayed with us. Okay. But it wasn't that he was a patient coming to.
No, I understand.
Right. It was a friendly thing, and we enjoyed each other, and we had a lot in common, and we did a lot together. And we both had this affection for John.
He was being younger than you.
No, I think Joseph's my age.
Your age.
Yeah, I think it's, and Offer is sort of Phyllis's age. Isn't that funny? Phyllis is good about him. If I find anything that would be sort of mildly interesting, I'll tell you, but I can't remember how it was that they kind of stayed in our lives that way.
What was your contact with John before he died?
He had referred, another person, a young guy from New York City who was a remarkable artist, and it was telephone. He talked at length, and now we've got very difficult. I can't remember how much Joseph and Ofra told me about. I can't remember where I heard that he was going to go on vacation in the Virgin Islands. I think Joseph told me. Or it could have been one of the women. We had a wonderful woman he referred who was very close to him and at one point us, and she might have told me. But we hadn't been in very close touch for quite some time before that.
And so you knew John was going on holiday to the Virgin?
Yes. And then the next thing I heard was that he was dead. And I think it was Joseph who told me that too.
And who ran?
Well, the only way to check that out would be to ask Joseph, but I think it was Joseph.
Oh, I see. Joseph ran you?
I think so.
He wasn't at Springlake Ranch?
Oh, no, he was never a resident of Springlake or anything like that.
No, I'm not saying resident.
Right.
He wasn't out on a visit?
No. Not even at the time?
Yes.
I don't think so. If they've got a memory of it, take theirs, because it's hazy in my mind. Do they have a memory of it?
Oh, so they're very busy.
She does? Were they with us?
That was my understanding.
Oh, no, she'll be right.
And she screamed.
Oh, well then,
Yeah,
no, then that makes sense. That makes sense.
Who would have run
To tell us, or tell her.
you?
Well, if you know who I think it could have been. In fact, I almost now it comes back. Life's gone on, and I don't think it's any harm in saying that. Has the name Lindell Copeland come up? No. Well, she was someone who was with us, and my recollection is that I heard from her. I would have said earlier that it was from Joseph, but if they were with us, that's impossible. Yeah. No, I wouldn't want to say with any degree of certainty how I heard, and I don't recall that particular exchange. And that's pretty powerful, so I'm surprised I don't, But if in her mind, it's very much there.
Okay. And did you go to the memorial?
Yes, which was very moving.
It surprised, how can I say it? What aspects did you...
Well, again, I'm hazy on this, but this notion that he committed suicide was introduced to me, either by Joseph or Offer or somebody. And I wasn't terribly surprised if that was true. I don't even know that it was true. I don't know anybody knows it's true. But it didn't sort of blow me away and make me think, that's impossible, or you've got to be lying, or whatever. It just seemed, in the scheme of things, there was some logic to it. So then, you're right, and that's very much evidence to suggest that would never have happened. Now, why did that rumor, why did that thought, where did it come from? Have you figured, has anyone else said that?
It was certainly discussed, and it seemed so serious of that for many reasons.
Yes.
He was a strong swimmer.
Yes.
He knew a great deal about the physiology of respiration,
Right.
research work. And I think people just felt that this was plausible, but it's never been...
No one's gotten any further.
No. But it was certainly something that wasn't discussed.
Yeah. That's as much as I've ever known. Just that much. But also that it didn't seem out of the cards. You're right about the Catholicism, but there were just times when when it seemed he was carrying one huge burden. That certainly came across. But it's quite wrong for me to suggest that I think he did. that doesn't make sense. It's just that it wasn't surprising that he died.
Can I ask about something else?
Yeah.
Did he ever talk about things like art therapy, dance therapy?
Yeah, art therapy. Yes, he did. And he was three of the people he referred to as were kind of budding artists. One was the young man I think I mentioned to you who...
This is the Bostonian?
No, the Bostonian is another one. The young boy, very young, who actually designed the logo on our brochure. To John, art was, I can't say exactly what it was, but it was such an integral part of so many of the people he worked with lives that it clearly was terribly important to him. The fact that the majority of people he referred to us were in one way or another, artists.
Did you refer any actors?
No. But he talked about actors and artists.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is a reason why I'm asking this. Did he have an opinion on methods? Did he, if you would think about it as a sort of sum him up and give meaning to you, I mean, you see somebody who was, who caused you to rethink issues or to develop issues or something, because you were already sort of on a path.
I was. But he pushed me. When I talk about things we were doing at the ranch or what we'd done with a particular person or this or that, he was the kind of person who'd say, why? What are you trying to accomplish? Why can't you do this instead of that? It was like I felt he was sort of pushing the boundaries of my humanity, you know, challenging me to be more thoughtful as a human being in relation to any other human being. But, you know, professionally, he didn't, we never talked about it. It's funny, I'm apt when I'm with people like that to sort of apologize for the fact that I'm not coming with any qualifications. And he had that ability to make that all unnecessary. He was very affirming. Well, it was affirming to me that he even had contact with me, because to me he simply was he was a big man, you know. And no, I mean, it is odd that, you know, I don't know what's like in your life, but you really, I don't know what other people experience, but I don't think one meets many people who make a profound difference. And sometimes you don't even think about why they make a profound difference, but he certainly is one of those people. I don't want to go off on a tangent now, but there's a person in my life who is, to me, much like him, and she is the former wife of one of the people Hitler hung, because he was part of the plot against Hitler. Friar von Moltke. Helmut von Moltke was one of the people Hitler hung. And his wife lives near us, and I see her almost every other month for breakfast. She's got that same quality of being somewhat larger than life and in a spiritual way, and you just feel so privileged to know people like that, you know.
Was the name Matthias Lieber?
No. What's the second name?
Lieber.
No. No. Lieber, L-E-E-R.
If you mention that to Driver North, she will know the name Lieber.
Lieber, L-E-V-E-R. Yeah. The friar, like John, kept referring people, but in the friar's case, they were often people who
she never knew John.
Well, she did, in the sense that she was at that meeting, and you know, she does because I talked about it. We talked about John too, so much.
So she's on the board.
She's an honorary trustee. Yeah, she's 90.
Well, I could tell you a little bit of the story, I suppose. Did you have any strong views about conventional psychiatry? What were his views?
I don't think I can answer that. There certainly weren't very many people in the field that he knew that were part of conversations. Because the period that I knew him was literally that period when the kind of analytic approach to training was beginning to be questioned, and medicines were coming in. And I never knew whether he was violently anti-medicine, for medicine. I couldn't. And I think I must have discussed it with him because our psychiatrist was so strong in favor of him. But my assumption was that he probably felt they were going to be used, in a more or less punishing way. But he didn't. Perhaps he was being careful. I think he might have been being careful because he knew I had great respect for Hans-Hussey, and that Hans-Hussey was our psychiatrist. But I don't think if you'd had them in a room together, they would necessarily have found any points of contact, except in belief in something like Eau Vive and the Ranch and so on. It was more, I think the way that the medical part of psychiatry was going, I never got a real sense of what he felt.
So he can combine the patients and everything.
Well, I do know that I don't think he liked it a lot. That much I know.
What about how you know?
Yes. Oh yeah, because he was part of the Henderson group. And I met R.D. Laing a number of times in later years because he had a quite close relationship with another little halfway house that was started in New Hampshire, and we were quite close to them. So I heard Laing talk to their annual meeting or staff or whatever, and describe the training he had in Scotland. And I wonder whether they weren't somewhat alike in the sense that I think they both had a great deal of skepticism about medication. I felt that about John, but it would have been pointless for him to say much because Hans-Hussey had no skepticism about medication.
Okay. But he never spoke about it.
He just said, I know him. I was in school with him. Or were you in school with him? No. He knew of him. And there was more than Laing. There was, well, I can't remember the names of the people now, but no, I'm pretty sure he knew him. Yeah.
Was Joe Burke, that he interviewed?
No.
There was double biography very well.
Oh, really? He wrote it, you knew?
Yes, it was a student for children.
No, I didn't know that.
The introduction.
Ah, that's a great story.
Okay. So I think it was a meeting of minds with Laing.
Oh, I did too. I felt that there was a meeting of minds, and Laing's unit in the Henderson Hospital. We heard Laing speak, and then his nurse, not his nurse, a nurse who had worked at Henderson Hospital spoke at another meeting I went to the following, and she was Scottish. She had the most wonderful brogue. And she said, Laing's just full of it. I mean, don't take half he says as truth, you know. She said she had not much respect for him. But that was that's not the end of it.
Did John give you any book?
No.
And you just spoke over the phone, you didn't write to each other? Or?
No, we talked to each other on the phone occasionally, or, as I say, we had these relatively brief, not brief, but relatively sporadic meetings where we would go places and do things. He never wrote to me, as far as I know, and I never wrote to him.
So I could read.
Exactly. I don't think I even knew his address. Oh, of course I did, because I went up to the apartment. But beside that, I
think you've been wonderful.
Well,
thank you very much for speaking at such length. I think you.